The fourth bottle of $400 champagne had just arrived when Aunt Brenda pointed at my 10-year-old adopted daughter. "Sweetie, why don't you move to the side table?" she asked loudly. "The main seating is for real blood family." My brother smirked, swirling his drink. My parents stared at their plates in total silence. I looked at the people I had just spent 2 months and $12,500 trying to honor. I did not yell. I simply set my silver fork down. The illusion was finally over. "I am Harper." I pushed my chair back from the table. The heavy mahogany legs scraped softly against the polished hardwood floor of the sapphire room. It was a subtle sound, but in the sudden vacuum of conversation, it felt like a gavel striking wood. Lily looked up at me, her small hands resting nervously on her lap. She was wearing the pale blue dress we had picked out together specifically for Arthur's 70th birthday dinner. I reached down and gently took her hand. Her fingers were cold. I stood up, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I looked at Brenda, who was already raising her wine glass to take a sip, completely unbothered by the cruelty she had just casually dropped onto a child. Then I looked at Caleb, my 38-year-old brother, who was too busy admiring the label on the expensive champagne he had ordered on my dime to even notice the shift in the room. Finally, my eyes landed on Margaret and Arthur. They refused to meet my gaze. I helped Lily put on her small cardigan. Caleb finally glanced over, a lazy, entitled smirk playing on his lips. He probably thought I was taking her to the restroom so the adults could enjoy the feast. I did not correct him. I did not say a single word. Any explanation would have been a waste of oxygen on people who measured loyalty by blood and submission. I guided Lily toward the heavy double doors of the private dining room, out in the quiet, carpeted hallway of the historic Charleston Country Club. The air felt easier to breathe. The manager of the events team, a polite woman named Sarah, was waiting near the host stand. She smiled warmly when she saw me, unaware of the fracture that had just occurred. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black leather folio. Inside was the finalized receipt for the evening, $12,500, the room rental, the custom menu, the floral arrangements, and Caleb's absurdly expensive liquor choices, all paid in full, authorized by my personal black card 3 days prior. I handed the folio to the manager. I kept my voice entirely even, stripping away any trace of the betrayal burning in my chest. I instructed her to wait exactly 1 hour. Once they finished their main courses and before the cake was brought out, she was to present this closed folio to the table. If they asked any questions, she was to simply state that the host had departed and the bill had been settled. She looked slightly confused, but nodded professionally. I thanked her, held Lily's hand a little tighter, and walked out through the grand glass doors into the warm, humid night. The crickets were chirping in the manicured bushes. I secured Lily in the backseat of my car, making sure she was comfortable. Before I continue, I have to ask, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Tell me in the comments if this resonates. I started the engine quietly. I did not peel out of the parking lot. I drove down the sweeping driveway of the country club with absolute precision. The rear-view mirror reflected the glowing lights of the sapphire room shrinking into the distance. I never looked back. The drive back to our neighborhood was silent, save for the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the emotional weight of a room that did not want her. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror, feeling a profound sense of clarity. For 35 years, I had allowed my identity to be shaped by the impossible expectations of my family. I was Harper, the dependable one, the one who fixed problems, the one who quietly absorbed the tension so others could shine. But outside of that suffocating dynamic, I was someone entirely different. I was a heritage conservation architect. I spent my days restoring historical buildings across the state, preserving structures that had weathered centuries of storms. I understood foundations. I knew how to identify rot hiding behind fresh paint, and I knew when a structure was too compromised to be saved. It was ironic that it took me this long to apply those exact same principles to my own blood relatives. My husband, Owen, had recognized the structural damage in my family years ago. He was a structural engineer, a man built on logic and quiet strength. He never forced me to cut ties. He never issued ultimatums. He simply provided a safe harbor, waiting patiently for the day I would finally see the cracks for myself. Our home was a reflection of that peace. It was a restored craftsman house filled with natural light, thriving plants, and genuine warmth. It was everything the Sapphire Room was not. To Margaret and Arthur, my career was nothing more than a convenient backup fund for the family. They knew I made a good living, but they deliberately minimized my success to protect Caleb's fragile ego. In their minds, I was just making ends meet, lucky to have a stable job. They believed that any excess wealth I possessed was a communal asset, meant to be funneled quietly toward my older brother whenever his grandiose schemes inevitably collapsed. I had stopped correcting their assumptions a long time ago. Let them think I was boring. Let them think my life was unremarkable. Privacy was the greatest luxury I had ever afforded myself. I did not wear designer clothes to their Sunday dinners. I did not mention the lucrative government contracts my firm had secured. I certainly did not tell them about the investment portfolio Owen and I had steadily built over the last decade. They only saw what they wanted to see: a dutiful daughter who would always fall in line when the family called. I pulled into our driveway. The porch light was on, casting a golden, welcoming glow across the wooden steps and the blooming hydrangeas I had planted last spring. Owen's car was parked in its usual spot. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin of the car for a long moment, listening to the steady rhythm of Lily's breathing. The contrast between the toxic performance I had just left and the genuine sanctuary I had returned to was staggering. The heavy chains of obligation I had dragged around for decades were finally beginning to rust and break. I unbuckled my seatbelt, feeling lighter than I had in years. Silence was my true sanctuary. The truth was, the financial boundary I had crossed tonight was not the first. It was simply the first one they were going to find out about. As I carried a sleeping Lily up the stairs and tucked her into her bed, my mind drifted back to a crisp Tuesday morning exactly 3 years ago. It was the day I had quietly shifted the balance of power in our family without a single person realizing it. 3 years ago, Caleb had convinced Arthur to co-sign a massive loan for a new cryptocurrency mining venture. Like all of Caleb's brilliant ideas, it was built on buzzwords, arrogance, and absolutely zero actual labor. Within 8 months, the market shifted, the venture folded, and the bank came knocking for the collateral. The collateral was the summer cabin. The cabin was a sprawling, rustic property nestled deep in the mountains, purchased by my grandfather decades ago. It was the crown jewel of the family's identity. Caleb hosted loud weekend parties there every July, acting like a wealthy aristocrat generously opening his estate to his friends. Margaret and Arthur spent their autumns there, posting endless photos of the lake to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. Losing it would have been a public humiliation they could not survive. Margaret had called me, sobbing hysterically, begging me to empty my savings to bail Caleb out. I refused to give Caleb cash. I knew it would just vanish into another scam. But I also knew the cabin held genuine historical value and sentimental memories of my grandfather. the only person who had ever truly praised my architectural sketches when I was a child. So, I made a different arrangement. I contacted the bank independently. I sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a downtown law firm, listening to the hum of the air conditioner as my attorney slid a thick stack of documents across the mahogany table. I signed my name 22 times. I did not pay off Caleb's bad debt. Instead, I purchased the foreclosed property outright through an anonymous irrevocable trust, managed by my firm. The bank was satisfied. The foreclosure notices stopped. Margaret and Arthur assumed Arthur's desperate negotiations had somehow saved the day, and Caleb went right back to hosting his ridiculous parties, completely oblivious to the fact that the roof over his head legally belonged to his little sister. I never told them. I paid the annual property taxes in silence, treating it as a conservation investment. For 3 years, I had allowed them to parade around in a house they no longer owned, protecting their fragile pride at the cost of my own recognition. I had let Caleb strut across the wooden deck overlooking the lake, holding a beer and boasting about his property value, while the official deed sat locked securely inside a fireproof safe in my home office. I walked into my office now, the moonlight filtering through the blinds, and let my fingers brush against the cold steel of that very safe. Buying the cabin had been an act of preservation, not just of a building, but of the family peace Margaret constantly preached about. I had foolishly believed that if I saved them from ruin, the universe would somehow balance the scales. I had thought that my silent sacrifice would eventually earn me a seat at the table, a genuine smile, or perhaps just a modicum of basic respect. But tonight, in the Sapphire Room, I had learned the ultimate lesson about silent sacrifices. If you do not force people to acknowledge your worth, they will gladly consume everything you have and still complain about the taste. He owned absolutely nothing. People often ask how a seemingly intelligent, capable woman ends up spending $12,500 on a dinner for people who actively despise her. The answer is rarely simple stupidity. It is conditioning. It is a slow, methodical training process that begins the moment you are old enough to understand the dynamics of your own household. Growing up, I was the dependable child, the capable one, the one who did not require maintenance. Margaret and Arthur were perpetually exhausted by Caleb's endless crises, his bad grades, his tantrums, and his constant need for validation. To survive in that environment, I learned to shrink. I learned that my value lay entirely in my ability to be invisible and useful. When I was 12, I quietly moved all my belongings into the cramped attic room because Caleb decided he needed the larger bedroom to set up his drum kit. A drum kit he played exactly 3 times before abandoning. Margaret had patted my shoulder and told me I was such a good, understanding sister. That pat on the shoulder became my currency. I craved it. I absorbed the discomfort so Margaret wouldn't have to deal with Caleb's wrath. When I was 18, I worked 2 jobs to pay for my own college tuition, taking on student loans that took me a decade to clear. Why? Because the college fund Arthur had supposedly set up for both of us was entirely drained to pay for Caleb's failed tech startup. "You are smart, Harper," Arthur had told me, staring at his shoes. "You will figure it out. Caleb needs a head start." The chain of the dependable child is forged entirely from guilt and the desperate hope that one day, your sacrifices will be recognized. You convince yourself that if you just give a little more, if you just host one more perfect event, if you just write one more check, they will finally look at you and see your worth. You become an emotional ATM, dispensing time, money, and energy, while the people withdrawing from you never even bother to check the balance. Booking the Sapphire Room for their 70th birthday was supposed to be my final, undeniable proof of love. I had meticulously planned every detail. I had coordinated with the chef for 2 months. I had selected the floral centerpieces based on Margaret's exact wedding bouquet from decades ago. I wanted to give them an evening so flawless, so undeniably generous, that they would have no choice but to acknowledge me as an equal. But toxic families do not operate on a system of gratitude. They operate on a system of entitlement. Giving them a beautiful evening did not make them grateful. It simply made them feel justified in their superiority. They viewed my effort not as a gift, but as a tax I owed them for the privilege of being in their presence. Recognizing that was the most painful, liberating moment of my life. As I stood in my quiet hallway, looking at the framed photographs of Owen, Lily, and myself, the invisible chain finally snapped. I was no longer willing to be the shock absorber for Caleb's failures or Margaret's willful ignorance. I was no longer going to set myself on fire just to keep them comfortably warm. The girl who gave up her bedroom and her college fund was gone, replaced by a woman who fully understood the power of a hard boundary. I stopped being the strong one. If my conditioning was the fertile soil of our family dysfunction, Caleb and Brenda were the poisonous weeds that thrived in it. Understanding the depth of their delusion requires understanding how they moved through the world. Caleb was 38, going on 16. He was a man who owned 3 different tailored suits, but hadn't held a steady paycheck in 5 years. Caleb considered himself an entrepreneur, a visionary unfairly burdened by a society that did not recognize his genius. In reality, he was a professional parasite. He bounced from crypto investments to dropshipping schemes, always needing just a little more capital from Margaret and Arthur to finally hit it big. And because they had spent his entire life shielding him from consequences, he genuinely believed he was the patriarch in waiting. He viewed my steady, quiet success not as an achievement, but as an insult to his own stalled life. Then there was Aunt Brenda. Brenda was Arthur's younger sister, a woman who wore her bitterness like an expensive perfume. She had married into minor wealth in her 20s, divorced in her 30s, and had spent the last 2 decades nursing a profound sense of victimhood. Brenda hated anyone who possessed the one thing she lacked: genuine independence. From the moment I started my architectural firm, Brenda made it her personal mission to cut me down at every family gathering. If I wore a nice dress, I was being flashy and materialistic. If I showed up in jeans, I was disrespecting the family by being sloppy. But her most venomous fixation was on a single piece of jewelry, my grandmother's vintage pearl necklace. My grandmother was a stern, observant woman who saw right through Brenda's superficiality. When she passed away, she explicitly bypassed her own daughter and left the pearls to me, writing in a small note that they belonged on a neck that held its head up through hard work, not arrogance. Brenda never forgave me for it. She spoke of those pearls as if I had broken into a museum and stolen them in the dead of night. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about how family heirlooms should remain with the true elders of the bloodline. This was the environment I had walked away from tonight. Caleb, inflating his ego by ordering $400 champagne he couldn't afford, using my credit card as his personal flex. Brenda, asserting her dominance by exiling a 10-year-old child because adopted blood wasn't pure enough for her refined sensibilities. And my parents, the silent enablers, watching it all happen with their heads bowed, sacrificing me to appease the loudest voices in the room. They had spent years mistaking my silence for weakness, my generosity for foolishness, and my patience for submission. They thought they had successfully trained me to endure any humiliation as long as it was served on a family platter. But they had miscalculated. You can only push a person to the margins for so long before they realize they prefer the view from the outside. As I checked the locks on my front doors and turned off the living room lights, I felt a strange sense of anticipation settling over me. The restaurant manager was likely approaching their table right at this very moment, Carrying that heavy leather folio, for the first time in my life, I was not going to be there to soften the blow. I was not going to pull out my card with a self-deprecating smile to save Caleb from embarrassment. I was going to let the cold, hard reality of mathematics crash down on their fantasy world. Their entitlement knew no limits. The only reason I survived the suffocating gravity of my family for as long as I did was Owen. We met 6 years ago, when his engineering firm was contracted to reinforce the foundation of a 19th century library my team was restoring. I respected him immediately because he dealt in absolute, measurable truths. Concrete either held or it cracked. Steel either carried the load or it buckled. He did not believe in illusions, and more importantly, he did not tolerate them. When I first introduced Owen to Margaret and Arthur, he was polite, observant, and incredibly quiet. It was during one of Caleb's infamous summer barbecues at the cabin. Caleb had cornered Owen by the grill, boasting about a new startup idea that involved importing luxury water, subtly hinting that he was looking for angel investors. Owen had simply listened, sipped his beer, and offered exactly $0. On the drive home that night, Owen did not give me a dramatic speech about my toxic family. He kept his eyes on the dark highway, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel. He simply asked me why I allowed Caleb to speak to me as if I were a subordinate employee. I tried to defend it. I gave him the standard rehearsed excuses. I told him it was just how Caleb was, that Margaret needed me to be the bigger person to keep the peace, and that Arthur hated conflict. Owen let me finish my defense. Then, with the calm, measured tone of a man diagnosing a structural failure, he told me that Caleb's greed was bottomless. He warned me that if I kept pouring my own foundation into their sinkhole, eventually, my house would collapse too. He never gave me an ultimatum. He never demanded that I cut them off. Owen understood that you cannot force someone to drop a heavy burden until their own arms are too tired to carry it anymore. Instead, he just provided a safe harbor. He built a life with me that was so fundamentally healthy, so rooted in mutual respect, that the contrast with my family slowly became impossible to ignore. Every time I returned from a dinner with Margaret and Brenda, feeling drained and belittled, Owen was there with a glass of wine and a quiet, steady presence. He was the anchor that kept me from drifting completely into their madness. When we decided to adopt Lily 2 years ago, Owen was the one who held my hand through the endless paperwork, the interviews, and the waiting. He was the one who painted her bedroom a soft, hopeful yellow. And when my family collectively decided to skip the final adoption hearing because Caleb had a minor networking emergency, Owen was the one who looked at me in the empty courthouse hallway and promised that our daughter would never lack for real love. He knew they would eventually cross a line that I could not forgive. He just waited patiently. Booking the Sapphire Room for Arthur's 70th birthday was not a random act of extravagance. It was a meticulously calculated final exam. For 2 solid months, I treated the event like one of my high-stakes architectural projects. I pored over the guest list. I negotiated with the country club's elite catering director to secure a private dining space that usually required a 6-month waiting list and a massive deposit. I paid the non-refundable $5,000 holding fee without a second thought. I wanted the evening to be an undeniable masterpiece. I chose the Sapphire Room specifically because it was the kind of old money, exclusive establishment that Brenda and Caleb spent their lives pretending they belonged to. It had crystal chandeliers, heavy velvet drapery, and a strict dress code. I knew the environment alone would stroke their inflated egos. I tailored every single detail to my parents. I requested a specific cut of dry-aged steak because it was the only meal Arthur ever truly raved about. I arranged for massive centerpieces of white stargazers and hydrangeas because Margaret had carried them on her wedding day. I even hired a string quartet to play soft classical arrangements of the jazz songs Arthur used to listen to when I was a little girl. The total bill, factoring in the premium wine pairings, the private staff gratuity, and the custom-layered cake, came to $12,500. I did not ask Caleb to chip in. I did not ask Brenda. I knew Caleb would claim he was waiting on a massive crypto return, and Brenda would somehow spin the request into an insult about my financial stability. I wanted to carry the weight alone. In my foolish, deeply conditioned heart, I believed that an event of this magnitude would finally break the spell. I thought that if Margaret and Arthur walked into a room dripping with elegance, fully funded by the daughter they constantly overlooked, they would have a moment of genuine clarity. I thought Arthur might pull me aside, look me in the eye, and say he was proud of the woman I had become. I thought Margaret might finally tell Caleb to stop making passive-aggressive jokes at my expense, just for one night. I wanted them to look at the beautiful, expensive reality I had constructed and realize that I was not just a backup plan. I was a successful, capable adult who loved them enough to give them the world. I was basically trying to purchase a mother's protection and a father's respect. But respect is not a commodity you can buy from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. I bought my own heartbreak. Everything unraveled because of Lily. If Brenda had directed her venom at my outfit, my career, or my marriage, I might have simply swallowed the insult. I had 35 years of practice digesting their disrespect. But when Aunt Brenda raised her manicured finger, pointed at my 10-year-old daughter, and suggested she eat at a side table because she was not real blood family, the dynamic fundamentally changed. Lily is a quiet, observant child. She spent the first 8 years of her life in a system that constantly made her feel temporary. When Owen and I brought her home, our singular goal was to build an absolute, unbreakable fortress of security around her. We promised her that she was permanently chosen. She was not a guest. She was the center of our family. Hearing Brenda casually demote Lily to second-class status over a plate of appetizers felt like a physical blow. I looked at Lily's face. I saw the sudden drop in her shoulders, the way she pulled her small hands into her lap, trying to make herself invisible. In a fraction of a second, I saw exactly what my family was doing. They were initiating my daughter into the exact same cycle of subjugation that had trapped me. They were teaching her that her worth was conditional, that her presence was an inconvenience, and that she would never truly belong. The maternal instinct is a terrifying, clarifying force. It is not always loud. In fact, true protective rage is utterly silent. My heart did not race. It slowed down. The ambient noise of the clinking glasses and the string quartet faded into a dull, distant hum. I looked at Brenda's smug, satisfied expression, and a cold, sterile realization washed over me. I could not save my family from their own toxicity, but I was absolutely going to save my daughter from it. Allowing Lily to sit at that table for one more minute would have been an endorsement of their cruelty. If I stayed, if I forced a tight smile and told Lily to ignore her great aunt, I would be passing down the heavy, rusted chain of the dependable child directly to her. I would be teaching her to tolerate abuse to keep the peace. That was a price I was completely unwilling to pay. No amount of historical family ties, no amount of shared holidays, and certainly no amount of misguided loyalty was worth my daughter's self-esteem. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for decades vanished. The people sitting around that table were not my family. They were just familiar strangers who shared my DNA. I became a mother first. The true villain in that private dining room was not Aunt Brenda. Brenda was merely a symptom of the disease. The real betrayal, the one that severed the final thread holding my loyalty intact, was the deafening silence of my parents. When Brenda made her comment about bloodlines, I paused for exactly 5 seconds. It was a small window of time, but it was long enough for someone, anyone, to intervene. I looked at Margaret, my mother, the woman who preached endless sermons about family unity, suddenly found her white linen napkin utterly fascinating. She smoothed the fabric with her thumb, her eyes firmly glued to her lap. She was calculating the social cost of confronting her wealthy sister-in-law, and she decided her granddaughter was not worth the friction. Then I looked at Arthur, the patriarch, the man whose milestone birthday we were celebrating in a $12,000 room I had paid for. Arthur cleared his throat. He reached for his water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down. He did not look at Brenda. He did not look at Lily. He simply stared at the floral centerpiece, waiting for the uncomfortable moment to pass so he could enjoy his dry-aged steak in peace. Their silence was not a neutral act. It was an active, deliberate choice. By saying nothing, they validated Brenda's cruelty. By looking away, they communicated to Lily that she was indeed an outsider, and to Caleb that his ensuing snickers were entirely acceptable. They chose the comfort of the abusers over the dignity of the innocent. For years, I had convinced myself that my parents were just victims of Caleb's manipulation and Brenda's domineering personality. I had played the role of their secret protector, absorbing the financial and emotional blows so they could maintain their fragile illusion of a happy family. But sitting in the sapphire room, the truth was glaringly obvious. They were not victims. They were the architects of this dysfunction. They had built a family culture where cruelty was tolerated and defense was considered bad manners. When I finally stood up and took Lily's hand, I felt no guilt. There was no internal debate, no lingering hope that I could somehow salvage the evening. I was stepping off a sinking ship that I had spent my entire life trying to bail out. As I guided my daughter out of the room, leaving my parents sitting in their cowardly silence, I realized that the greatest gift I could ever give them was exactly what they wanted. I gave them to each other. Silence is a loaded gun. Back in the safety of my own home, the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind a profound, clinical stillness. I walked into my master bathroom and turned on the brass faucet. The water ran warm over my hands. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the vanity. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was a highly successful, fiercely independent architect who had just successfully amputated a gangrenous limb. I took off the dark emerald silk dress I had bought specifically for the occasion and hung it in the closet. I slipped into comfortable cashmere lounge pants and an oversized gray sweater. Walking softly down the hallway, I peeked into Lily's room. She was deeply asleep, breathing evenly, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked securely under her arm. The cruelty of the sapphire room had not followed her home. The fortress Owen and I built had held. I walked down the stairs to the kitchen. The house was immaculate, smelling faintly of cedar and the lavender candles Owen liked to burn. It was a tangible testament to the life I had built with my own 2 hands. While Caleb was out chasing imaginary wealth and Brenda was busy guarding her fading social status, I had been quietly laying bricks. My architectural firm had just secured a massive municipal contract to restore the city's oldest theater. My investment portfolio, managed with strict discipline, was expanding. I had a husband who respected me and a daughter who adored me. I did not need Margaret's conditional approval. I did not need Arthur's delayed recognition. I certainly did not need to finance Caleb's delusions of grandeur. The most powerful realization of the night was recognizing that I held all the leverage. For years, they had operated under the assumption that I was desperate to remain in their inner circle. They treated me poorly because they believed I would never leave. They thought my tolerance was infinite. They had completely failed to understand that the quietest people are often the most observant, and the most dependable people are the hardest to replace. I poured myself a glass of cold, sparkling water and leaned against the granite kitchen island. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. It was 8:45. 15 minutes left until the manager of the country club would walk into the sapphire room with the black leather folio. I imagined them right now, finishing their expensive steaks, perhaps laughing at my dramatic exit, assuming I would return later to apologize for ruining the mood. They were currently sitting inside a luxury bubble that was entirely sustained by my bank account. The house of cards trembled. The digital clock on the microwave shifted from 8:59 to exactly 9 o'clock. In my mind, I traced the steps of the banquet manager. I imagined Sarah walking down the plush hallway, carrying the discreet black folder. I pictured her stepping through the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room, approaching Arthur's seat at the head of the table, and politely explaining that the host had departed. I envisioned the exact moment Caleb would reach for the bill, assuming he could simply charge it to the imaginary tab Margaret usually covered. At 9:13, my phone, resting face up on the kitchen counter, lit up. The screen displayed an incoming call from Margaret. I did not reach for it. I stood perfectly still, watching the device vibrate against the granite. It stopped after 4 rings, only to immediately start again. This time, it was Caleb, then Brenda, then Margaret again. The sudden, frantic barrage of incoming calls was the exact sound of their entitlement colliding with a $12,500 reality wall. It was the sound of 4 adults realizing that the invisible safety net they had abused for decades had just been violently yanked away. I picked up the phone, not to answer, but to watch the notifications stack up on the lock screen. A text message from Caleb arrived first. "What the hell is this, Bill Harper? Pick up the phone right now." Seconds later, a message from Margaret popped up. "Harper, there has been a terrible mistake with the restaurant manager. They want a credit card. Please answer. Arthur is very upset." A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. There was no mistake. The bill was not an error. The only mistake was their assumption that I would continue to fund my own disrespect. Caleb had ordered 4 bottles of $400 champagne. Brenda had ordered premium seafood towers. They had gorged themselves on my generosity while simultaneously telling my daughter she did not belong at their table. Now, the feast was over, and the check was due. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them a tearful confrontation where they would inevitably try to gaslight me into believing I had overreacted. The numbers on that restaurant folio spoke louder and clearer than any argument I could ever make. I watched the screen light up with one final call from Aunt Brenda. I let it ring twice. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I toggled the silent switch on the side of the device, turned the phone face down on the cold granite counter, and walked away into the quiet comfort of my living room. The illusion was finally dead. The morning after the dinner at the Sapphire Room, I woke up to a house filled with quiet sunlight and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Owen was already in the kitchen, preparing pancakes for Lily. It was a perfectly ordinary Saturday, except for the heavy silence radiating from my phone resting on the kitchen counter. I poured myself a cup of dark roast, added a splash of almond milk, and finally unlocked the screen. There were 74 unread messages in the family group chat, alongside dozens of direct texts. I scrolled to the very top, to the moment the restaurant manager must have delivered the $12,500 reality check. The progression of their panic was highly predictable. It started with confusion, quickly morphed into outrage, and finally settled into a deep, toxic victimhood. Margaret's texts were the most prolific. She did not ask if Lily was okay. She did not apologize for Brenda's blatant cruelty. Her entire focus was on the social embarrassment. "How could you do this to Arthur on his 70th birthday?" she wrote. "The manager looked at us like we were criminals. You made your own family look like beggars in front of the entire country club. You need to call me immediately and explain this behavior." Caleb's messages were aggressive and entirely self-centered. He had apparently been forced to call 3 of his friends to wire him emergency funds to cover the exorbitant cost of the vintage champagne he had ordered to show off. "You are completely unhinged." His message read, "You owe me $4,000. I had to empty my trading account to get us out of that room. Do not think you are walking away from this." Then, there was Aunt Brenda. Her message was not sent to the group chat, but directly to me. It was short, venomous, and entirely characteristic of a woman who believed she was owed the world. "Your little stunt last night was pathetic. You have always been a selfish, arrogant girl. You owe this family an apology, and you owe us compensation for ruining the evening. We will be coming by to collect what belongs to us." I sat at the kitchen island, sipping my warm coffee, reading the words of the people who shared my blood. There was a time, perhaps only a few years ago, when reading these messages would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have drafted a dozen long, emotional replies, trying to explain my side, trying to make them understand why I was hurt. I would have begged for their empathy. But sitting there that morning, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. They were not capable of empathy. They were only capable of entitlement. Margaret wanted her perfect family image restored. Caleb wanted his money refunded. Brenda wanted my submission. Not a single one of them possessed the self-awareness to realize that the explosion was caused by their own matches. I did not reply to Margaret. I did not argue with Caleb. I certainly did not engage with Brenda. I simply closed the messaging app, placed the phone face down on the cool marble counter, and walked over to the stove to help Owen flip the pancakes. The chaos they were experiencing was entirely of their own making, and I was no longer volunteering to clean it up. They learned absolutely nothing. The silence stretched for 2 full days. I went back to my architectural firm, diving into the blueprints of the historic theater restoration. The precision of the lines and the logic of the structural supports were comforting. In my world, every action had a calculated reaction, and every load had a bearing wall designed to carry it. I preferred the predictable honesty of buildings to the chaotic manipulation of my relatives. On Tuesday afternoon, a severe thunderstorm warning prompted me to let my team leave the office early. The sky over Charleston had turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the air was thick with impending rain. I drove home, listening to a quiet jazz instrumental, enjoying the rare opportunity to have the house to myself for an hour before Owen picked up Lily from her after-school art program. I pulled into my driveway, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to hit the windshield. I grabbed my leather briefcase and hurried up the stone walkway to the front porch. As I reached for the handle, my hand froze. The heavy oak front door, which automatically locked when closed tightly, was resting slightly ajar. A thin sliver of dark hallway was visible through the crack. My pulse did not race, but a sharp, cold wave of alertness washed over me. Owen never left doors open. Lily was not home. I looked at the electronic keypad mounted next to the frame. The small green light was flashing, indicating that a valid entry code had been used to disarm the alarm system within the last 10 minutes. There was only one other person in the world who had a backup code to my house: Margaret. I had given it to her 5 years ago during a medical emergency, explicitly telling her it was only to be used if Owen and I were incapacitated. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Margaret had not come here herself. She had handed my security code over to people who felt entitled to my space. I did not call out to see who was inside. I did not panic. I quietly pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single, urgent text message to Owen. Someone is in the house. Used Margaret's code. Come home right now. I pushed the door open, stepping silently into the foyer. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. I could hear the faint, distinct sound of drawers opening and closing coming from the second floor. The sound was coming from the guest bedroom, a room I had recently converted into a small private study where I kept important documents and family heirlooms. I walked up the hardwood stairs, my footsteps completely silent against the runner rug. As I approached the open doorway of the study, I heard Aunt Brenda's sharp, irritated voice. Check the bottom drawer of the mahogany dresser. She always keeps the velvet boxes hidden in the back. The absolute audacity of the invasion settled into my chest, hardening into something resembling steel. They had not come to talk. They had not come to apologize. They had used my mother's betrayal to bypass my security and enter my sanctuary. They were treating my home like a self-serve compensation center for an imaginary debt. I stepped quietly into the doorway. Aunt Brenda was standing near the large mahogany dresser, holding a familiar, dark blue velvet box. It was the exact box that housed my grandmother's vintage pearl necklace. Caleb was crouched near my secondary desk, holding a small silver antique clock that had been a wedding gift from Owen's parents. The sheer visual of my brother and my aunt casually shopping through my personal belongings in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon was almost surreal. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a museum curator addressing unruly tourists. I hope you are finding everything to your liking. Caleb jumped, nearly dropping the silver clock onto the hardwood floor. Brenda spun around, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before her face hardened back into its usual mask of arrogant entitlement. She did not drop the velvet box. She actually gripped it tighter, lifting her chin as if she were the authority figure in the room. "You are home early," Brenda said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Margaret said you would be at the office until 6. We came to collect a few family items. Since you clearly have no respect for this family, you do not deserve to hold on to its heritage. Margaret gave you the security code to my home," I stated, making sure the fact hung heavily in the air. "And you used it to commit a felony." Caleb scoffed, standing up and puffing out his chest. "Do not be dramatic. Harper, nobody is committing a felony. You embarrassed us at the country club. You owe me $4,000 for that dinner. Consider this an even trade. We are taking what belongs to the family. That clock belongs to Owen's parents," I said smoothly. "And those pearls were legally willed to me. What you are doing is called burglary." Before Caleb could open his mouth to offer another ridiculous justification, the heavy sound of footsteps echoed on the stairs. Owen appeared behind me in the doorway. He was still wearing his work boots and a rain-dampened jacket. He looked at Caleb holding the clock, then at Brenda holding the jewelry box. His expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Put my wife's things down," Owen said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute, immovable weight of a concrete pillar. "And step away from the desk." Caleb tried to maintain his bravado. "Listen, Owen, this is family business. Harper owes us—" "I am going to count to 3. Owen interrupted, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket. "If those items are not back exactly where you found them, I am calling the Charleston Police Department, and I will press charges for breaking and entering. 1. Brenda looked at Caleb, her false confidence fracturing. She knew Owen did not make empty threats. With a sharp, Angry exhale, she tossed the velvet box onto the bed. Caleb quickly set the silver clock down on the desk. "You are tearing this family apart." Brenda hissed at me as she brushed past us toward the hallway. "No," I replied softly, not moving an inch as she passed. "I am just locking the door. Before we continue, let me ask you this. Would you have called the police? Or would you have handled the confrontation yourself? Tell me below in the comments if this resonates." Owen escorted them down the stairs and watched them hurry out into the pouring rain. He closed the heavy oak door and immediately engaged the deadbolt. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening to the finality of that sound. The front door clicked shut. The moment Caleb and Brenda's car disappeared down the rain-slicked street. Owen walked over to the electronic keypad by the front door. He did not ask for my permission, and he did not ask how I felt about Margaret. He simply opened the master settings and deleted the backup code my mother had possessed for 5 years. He then generated a new, complex sequence, effectively sealing the fortress. The psychological shift that occurred in that moment was profound. For years, I had kept a metaphorical door open for Margaret, hoping she would eventually step through it and choose to protect me over Caleb. By handing my security code to Aunt Brenda, Margaret had shown me exactly who she was. She was not a helpless victim of their domineering personalities. She was the person holding the door open for the wolves. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep and the storm outside had settled into a steady, quiet drizzle, my phone vibrated on the coffee table. I had left Caleb unblocked, primarily because documenting his erratic behavior seemed like a wise precaution. I picked up the device and read his latest message. His humiliation at being thrown out by Owen had rapidly mutated into aggressive, desperate anger. He needed to reassert dominance, and he reached for the only weapon he believed he had left. "You think you are so powerful because you live in a nice house?" Caleb wrote, "Well, you just crossed the line. I am officially banning you from the summer cabin. I am having the access gate codes changed tomorrow, and I am instructing the property manager to remove your name from the guest list. Do not even think about showing up there this autumn. You are cut off from the real family legacy." I read the text message twice. The sheer, breathtaking irony of his threat was almost too perfect. Caleb honestly believed he was the lord of the manor, wielding the power to exile me from the ancestral estate. He thought he was playing a master stroke, utilizing the crown jewel of our family's identity to crush my spirit. He had no idea that he was threatening to lock me out of a building that I legally owned. I did not reply to his message. I simply smiled, a genuine, quiet smile in the dim light of my living room. I stood up from the sofa and walked back up the stairs to my study. I bypassed the mahogany dresser they had tried to raid and went straight to the heavy steel safe bolted into the floor of my closet. I entered my personal combination, pulled the heavy lever, and opened the thick steel door. Inside, resting neatly beneath our passports and birth certificates, was a thick manila envelope bearing the embossed seal of my law firm. I pulled it out and untied the string closure. I slid the crisp, heavy stock documents onto my desk. The paper felt solid and real. It was not built on manipulation, guilt, or toxic family dynamics. It was built on the absolute certainty of the law. I looked at the signatures at the bottom of the page, confirming my complete and total control over the property Caleb believed he ruled. He made a fatal error. There is a fundamental difference between emotional manipulation and legal documentation. In toxic families, the currency is almost always emotional. Caleb and Brenda ruled through volume, guilt, and the threat of social exclusion. They believed that if they yelled loud enough, or if they acted offended enough, reality would simply bend to accommodate their narrative. But as an architect, I know that you cannot yell at a collapsing roof and expect it to stay up. You need structural integrity. You need beams, bolts, and mathematics. In the adult world, that structural integrity is provided by the law. The documents spread across my desk were the blueprints of my ultimate defense. 3 years ago, when the bank was preparing to foreclose on the summer cabin due to Caleb's catastrophic crypto failures, I did not just pay off his debt. Paying off his debt would have left his name on the deed, allowing him to leverage the property again the next time he needed cash. Instead, I had my attorney, Patricia, establish an irrevocable trust. The concept is quite simple, yet incredibly powerful. When property is placed into an irrevocable trust, it cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the grantor's named beneficiary. I was the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, the property was purchased by a limited liability company, an LLC, which was entirely owned and controlled by that exact trust. Caleb and Arthur's names were completely wiped from the chain of title. The bank had issued a new, pristine deed, transferring full ownership of the 10-acre property and the cabin itself to my LLC, because the transaction was handled quietly through the bank's foreclosure department. Caleb simply assumed Arthur had somehow renegotiated the terms of his loan. I had let him believe that convenient lie because it preserved the family peace. But peace was no longer the objective. I traced my finger over the raised notary seal on the final page of the deed. Caleb's text message threatening to ban me from the property was legally equivalent to a tenant threatening to evict the landlord. His words were dust. He had no authority to change gate codes. He had no authority to contact property managers. He was a guest residing in a house subsidized entirely by the sister he had spent his life belittling. This is why I did not panic when he sent that threat. This is why I did not cry when Margaret handed over my security code. Emotional attacks only work if you value the emotional connection. Once you sever that tie and rely strictly on the documented facts, the manipulator loses all their power. They are left punching at shadows, completely unaware that they are standing on a trapdoor you installed 3 years ago. I carefully placed the documents back into the manila envelope. I did not need to engage in a shouting match with Caleb to prove my point. I did not need to convince Margaret that I was a good daughter. I only needed to let the legal system execute the structural failure Caleb had designed for himself. Paperwork does not feel pity. The 30th day arrived with a crisp, unseasonably cool morning breeze rolling off the mountains. Owen and I drove up the winding dirt road toward the summer cabin, our tires crunching softly against the gravel. We were not there to help, and we were certainly not there to negotiate. We were there to observe the legal transition of the property. Parked at the edge of the driveway, its presence undeniable, was a local sheriff's cruiser. A deputy stood casually near the front porch, there simply to ensure the eviction proceeded without a breach of the peace. Caleb was hauling a series of cheap cardboard boxes out the front door and shoving them into the trunk of his leased sedan. The arrogant patriarch of the Sapphire Room was completely gone. In his place was an exhausted, humiliated man who was finally experiencing the unsoftened impact of his own failures. Without Margaret's bank account to shield him, and without my silent financial architecture holding up the roof, he looked remarkably small. He saw me leaning against my car, but he didn't yell or hurl another baseless accusation. He simply looked away. He had nothing left to leverage. Later that afternoon, I learned that Brenda was facing her own consequences. News of the aborted lawsuit and her attempted theft had leaked, and she was suddenly being quietly excluded from her country club luncheons. As Caleb backed his overloaded sedan down the driveway, leaving the ancestral cabin he had falsely claimed as his kingdom, I took the keys and stepped inside the quiet, empty house. Holding on to the property was never my long-term plan. It was a monument to a toxic legacy. Within 2 weeks, I listed the 10-acre estate with a premium real estate agency, and it sold almost immediately to a retired couple from out of state. They had no idea about the drama that had saturated those wooden walls. To them, it was just a beautiful house by a lake. When the final wire transfer cleared into my trust account, bringing in a massive 7-figure return, I sat down with Owen and Patricia to draft a new set of documents. I took the entire sum generated by the sale of that toxic family asset and established a permanent, irrevocable educational foundation named after Lily, designed to provide full university scholarships for children who had aged out of the foster care system. The fund would outlast every single person who had sat at that table in the Sapphire Room. Margaret and Arthur believed that legacy was simply a matter of shared DNA, binding people together even if they treated each other terribly. I chose to define it differently, transforming the resources that had once propped up Caleb's delusions into a system that would quietly fund the futures of children who actually needed a safety net. The final confrontation happened quietly, right in the lobby of my architectural firm. I was walking out of a client meeting when I saw Arthur standing near the reception desk, looking noticeably older. We sat down in a glass-walled sitting area, the ambient noise of the busy office creating a wall of professional privacy. "I am sorry," Arthur said, forcing himself to meet my eyes. "I am sorry for what Caleb said, for what Brenda did to Lily, and most of all, that I sat there and drank my water while it happened. I spent my whole life avoiding arguments, and I lost my daughter because of it. 5 years ago, an apology like this would have brought me to tears, eager to resume my role as the dependable peacemaker, but I was no longer that woman. "I forgive you," I said gently but firmly. He smiled, suggesting we get coffee next week, or that I come by for a holiday. "No," I replied smoothly. "Forgiveness means I am no longer holding on to the anger. It does not mean I am offering you access to my life again. The boundary is permanent." He nodded slowly, accepting the heavy reality. I let him walk away. Sunday mornings in our house are deliberately slow. Sunlight filtered through the bay windows as Owen flipped blueberry pancakes at the stove, and Lily intensely focused on a watercolor painting at the granite island. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, breathing in the scent of vanilla and absolute peace. Suddenly, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unknown local number. It was likely Margaret, attempting to bypass the digital block I had placed on her weeks ago. I didn't feel a spike of adrenaline. With the fluid motion of my thumb, I declined the call, permanently blocked the new number, and set the phone face down. Many believe that family is a sacred contract requiring you to endure endless disrespect for a shared bloodline. But true cruelty is demanding that someone bleed quietly just so the rest of the family can pretend the house is clean. Walking away was not about revenge, it was about preservation. Legacy is what you protect, what you build, and what you refuse to pass down. I looked at Owen handing Lily a fresh pancake, listening to the bright, unburdened sound of her laughter. The $12,500 I spent on that anniversary dinner was the most valuable purchase I ever made. It bought my complete freedom. I had finally found my home,